Ethan Harper never expected that returning to his hometown would feel like stepping into a ghost from his past. As he stood in his sleek, black car, staring out over the sleepy town he once called home, memories he'd buried long ago stirred like a storm on the horizon. His phone buzzed. His team was waiting for his final approval to move forward with the project that would turn this rundown town into the next tech hub. He could change everything with a single signature, but something, or rather someone, stopped him. In the heart of the town square, she stood, Sarah Lawson. Her eyes were fierce, her sign trembling in the wind. "We won't be driven out." Her gaze locked on his, a silent confrontation that ignited the air between them. Ethan's heart tightened, a name he hadn't spoken in years echoing in his mind. Sarah, his childhood best friend, his first love, the woman he left behind without a word when his future called. Now she was the leader of a movement that could destroy everything he'd worked for. And the worst part? She had no idea that the man behind the corporation threatening her home was him. In that moment, Ethan realized he wasn't just here to build an empire. He was about to come face to face with the one person who could unravel his entire world. But as the past collided with the present, he couldn't shake one haunting question. Was this really about saving the town? Or was it about making amends for a betrayal he never dared admit? Ethan Harper gripped the steering wheel tightly as his sleek black SUV rumbled down the old cracked roads of his hometown. He hadn't set foot in this place for over a decade, and the weight of returning hit him harder than he'd expected. The once bustling main street, now dotted with boarded-up windows and crumbling facades, stood in stark contrast to the glittering cities where he'd built his empire. He had left this small town behind to chase his dreams, to become someone the world would notice, and he had succeeded. At 34, Ethan was a self-made tech mogul, his company on the verge of launching a billion-dollar expansion. But the town he once called home was about to become collateral damage. The project that could catapult his business into the stratosphere would raise the very place he grew up. It was business, pure and simple, or so he told himself. As he rolled into the town square, his eyes scanned the familiar landmarks. The old diner, the playground where he'd scraped his knees as a kid, the community center that hosted every dance and bake sale. They were still standing, but barely. Ghosts of a once vibrant town now hanging on by a thread. But something else caught his eye. A crowd had gathered near the town hall. Handmade signs waved in the air. "Save our town! We won't be driven out!" And at the center of it all, leading the charge, was someone Ethan hadn't seen in years. Sarah Lawson. His breath caught in his throat. There she was, her dark hair tied back, eyes fierce with determination. Time had done little to diminish the energy she carried. She was still as strong-willed as ever, but now that strength was directed at him, though she had no idea. Ethan's heart pounded as memories flooded back. Sarah had been his closest friend, the one person who knew him before he became Ethan Harper, the tech giant. She was also the one he'd hurt the most when he left without so much as a goodbye, chasing success while she stayed behind, tethered to the town. He could feel the tension building in his chest. This wasn't just any protest, it was a fight against the very project that had brought him back here. Ethan's latest venture, Harper Tech's state-of-the-art development, promised to bring jobs and infrastructure to the region, but at a cost. It would demolish the old town center, displacing hundreds of residents and bulldozing Sarah's entire world. As the crowd chanted louder, Sarah raised her megaphone, her voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about buildings. This is about people, families. We won't let corporate greed erase us." Ethan clenched his jaw, his gut twisting. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was his assistant, awaiting his final go-ahead to greenlight the project. Just one word from him, and the plans would move forward, and the town would be wiped off the map. He stared down at the phone, his finger hovering over the screen. He could sign off on the project right now and leave this place behind, just like before. But the pull of the past was stronger than he anticipated. His eyes drifted back to Sarah, standing tall at the center of the protest. She didn't know yet, She didn't know that the man responsible for tearing her world apart was sitting just across the street, watching her fight for the very life she'd built. Could he do this to her? The question gnawed at him. The Ethan Harper who had left this town behind all those years ago wouldn't have thought twice. He had always been focused on the next big thing, the next deal, the next win. But now as he watched the fierce determination in Sarah's eyes, something inside him began to crack. There was a part of him, buried deep beneath the success and money, that remembered what it felt like to care about more than just profit margins. The guilt began to creep in, suffocating him. He turned off his phone and pulled the car into a side street, parking just out of sight. He needed a moment. He hadn't even spoken to Sarah yet, but already the weight of their history was pressing down on him like a heavy fog. What would she say if she saw him now? Would she hate him for leaving? For coming back with the power to destroy everything she had fought so hard to protect? The thought haunted him. He stepped out of the car and leaned against the door, staring at the small town he once knew like the back of his hand. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and distant rain, a smell he hadn't realized he'd missed. But it was more than just nostalgia pulling at him. It was unfinished business, unspoken words, feelings he had buried under a mountain of success. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah lingered near the steps of the town hall, her face flushed from the heat and passion of the protest. Ethan felt a pang of something. Regret, maybe? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing: he couldn't hide forever. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street, each step heavier than the last. His heart raced as he approached her, the gap between them shrinking with every breath. Sarah turned, her eyes scanning the quieting square, and then they locked onto him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to stop as their eyes met, and Ethan saw the flicker of recognition in her gaze. But it wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper, something complicated, something that said their story wasn't over yet. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Sarah." A lifetime of words hung in the air between them, words that had been left unsaid for years, but now demanded to be spoken. The silence between them felt like a chasm, an invisible wall built from years of unresolved tension. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared into Sarah's eyes, trying to gauge her reaction. She didn't look angry, but there was something in her expression he couldn't quite place, something deeper, more complex. "Sarah," he repeated, his voice softer this time, as if he were afraid to break the fragile moment hanging between them. She blinked, her surprise slowly giving way to something else. "Ethan Harper, of all the people I thought would show up here today." Her voice trailed off, and she crossed her arms, as if trying to protect herself from whatever was coming next. "What are you doing back?" There it was, the question he'd been dreading. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected to face her so soon. He hadn't expected to face her at all. He was supposed to come, sign off on the project, and leave, clean and simple. But now, standing in front of Sarah, it was anything but simple. "I'm here for business," Ethan said, his voice lacking the confidence he was known for. He watched her expression shift, the weight of his words sinking in. "Business," she echoed, her brow furrowing. "What kind of business would bring you back here?" Ethan hesitated. He had always been a master of words, a man who could talk his way into and out of any situation. But right now, standing before Sarah, the words he needed felt out of reach. There was no easy way to explain that his business could bulldoze the only home she had ever known. Ethan stammered, something he hadn't done in years. "It's complicated." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Complicated?" "Ethan, you haven't set foot in this town for over 10 years. You left without a word, and now you're telling me you're here for business? What kind of business is worth tearing up everything we ever knew?" Her words hit him like a punch in the gut. She had every right to be angry. He had walked away from their friendship, no, from her, when she needed him most. And now here he was, standing in the middle of the battle she was fighting to save the town. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "You know, I used to wonder if you ever thought about this place, about us, but then I realized, you don't look back, do you? You just move on, make your millions, and forget where you came from. The accusation stung, and it took everything in Ethan not to flinch. She wasn't wrong. He had buried the past so deep, he thought he'd never have to face it again. But here it was, crashing down on him like a tidal wave. "I didn't forget, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then why did you leave?" she shot back, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you even say goodbye?" Ethan felt his throat tighten, the memories flooding back. He had left because staying had become too hard. Sarah had been everything to him, his best friend, his confidant, the girl he thought he might love. But when his tech career began to take off, he convinced himself that staying would only hold him back. He had told himself that leaving was the only way to make something of himself, but now standing before her, he realized just how much he had lost in the process. "I was stupid," Ethan admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "I thought leaving was the right thing. I thought I had to let go of this place, of you, to get where I wanted to be." Sarah's face softened, just for a moment, but the hurt in her eyes was still there. "And where has it gotten you, Ethan? A business empire? All the money you could ever want?" She paused, her voice turning cold. "And now you're here to take away the last thing this town has left?" Ethan blinked, confused. "Take away?" Sarah's eyes bore into his, and it felt like she was searching for something. "Don't act like you don't know," she said quietly, almost bitterly. "This protest, the one you saw me leading, it's against Harper Tech. Your company. They want to demolish half the town to make room for your shiny new tech hub. People are losing their homes, Ethan. Families are being displaced. And you're standing there pretending you don't know?" The truth hit him like a freight train. He hadn't realized just how personal this was. His company's expansion plan wasn't just some faceless development project. It was a wrecking ball, poised to tear down the very heart of the town he'd once called home. And Sarah was at the center of the fight to stop it, his stomach twisted in knots. "Sarah, She cut him off, shaking her head. "You don't even know, do you? You didn't even bother to check." Her voice cracked, and Ethan could hear the raw emotion behind it. "You left, and now you're back to destroy what little is left. How could you, Ethan?" Ethan felt the weight of his decisions crashing down on him. He had been so consumed with building his empire that he had become blind to the consequences. And now, standing before the one person who had always believed in him, he realized just how much he had failed her. "Sarah, I swear, I didn't know it was this project. I had no idea it would..." He stopped, realizing how hollow his words must sound. "I didn't know." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. Her gaze was hard, the hurt too deep. "It's too late, Ethan. I don't know what you came back for, but this town doesn't need your pity. We don't need your money, and we certainly don't need you." Ethan's chest tightened as he watched Sarah turn away, her figure disappearing into the crowd. The weight of guilt pressed down on him like never before. He had come back expecting to breeze through a business deal, but now he was standing in the ruins of his past, facing the woman he had betrayed. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town square, Ethan stood there alone, the echoes of Sarah's words ringing in his ears. He had come back to sign off on a project that would change his future. But now he realized it wasn't his future that needed saving, it was hers. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling as the weight of the day pressed heavily on his chest. The confrontation with Sarah played on a loop in his mind, her voice trembling with anger and pain, her eyes once so full of life and trust, now hardened against him. How had he let things get this far? The guilt gnawed at him like a relentless tide, rising higher with every passing minute. He had come back for a quick, clean business deal, but now it felt like he was drowning in everything he had tried to forget. Ethan could handle tough negotiations, ruthless investors, and billion-dollar decisions. But this was different. This was personal, and the worst part? He hadn't even realized it until now. He ran his hands through his hair, his mind racing. What if Sarah's right? What if his relentless pursuit of success had blinded him to the lives he was affecting? To her life? Unable to stand the suffocating silence of the hotel room, Ethan grabbed his jacket and left, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped onto the dimly lit street. The town was eerily quiet now, the remnants of the day's protests scattered across the square. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the community center, the one place that still seemed to matter in this dying town. His heart clenched as he approached the familiar building. It was where he and Sarah had spent countless afternoons after school, laughing and planning futures that had seemed so simple then. Futures that didn't include leaving anyone behind. A light was on inside. Curiosity and an inexplicable pull led him to the door. He hesitated, but then the thought of Sarah, alone inside, made him push it open. The soft glow of the lights bathed the room in a quiet warmth, and there, sitting at one of the old wooden tables, was Sarah. Her hair was messy and her face looked tired, but there was a quiet strength in the way she sat, sorting through stacks of papers, documents about the town, no doubt. She didn't notice him at first, too absorbed in her work. Ethan's heart raced. He knew he shouldn't be here, but something about seeing her like this, so focused, so determined, made him stay. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just watched as she fought for a town that seemed to be slipping through her fingers. But eventually the silence broke. "You're still fighting," Ethan said softly from the doorway, his voice betraying more emotion than he intended. Sarah looked up, startled at first. Her eyes met his, and for a brief second, he saw the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. But it vanished quickly, replaced by the guarded expression she had worn earlier. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" she asked, her tone flat, though not as harsh as before. He stepped into the room, unsure of what he was going to say. The weight of his guilt was unbearable, but there was something else too. Something about being in this place, with her, that made him want to explain, to fix what had been broken. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, walking slowly toward the table. "I've been thinking about what you said." Sarah's hands stilled over the papers, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at him. "And?" Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat. "And you're right," he confessed, the words heavy on his tongue. "I've been so focused on building my business, on chasing success, that I didn't stop to think about the consequences. Not for the people here, not for you." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Ethan could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to admit it. He continued, his voice low. "When I left, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I had to leave everything behind to succeed. But now, standing here, seeing what's happened to the town, to you," he paused, struggling to find the words. "I don't know if I made the right choice." The room was quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed over her chest. "It's not just about you, Ethan," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "It's about all of us. This town is dying, and people are holding on to whatever little they have left. And your company is coming in and taking even that away." Ethan nodded, guilt washing over him again. "I know. I didn't realize," his voice faltered. "I didn't know this was your fight." Sarah shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "Of course you didn't. You didn't care enough to check." The words stung, but Ethan couldn't argue. She was right. Again. He let out a long breath and sat down across from her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, the sincerity in his voice undeniable. "I'm sorry for leaving the way I did. I'm sorry for everything." For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything. She just stared at him, as if trying to decide whether to believe him or not. The air between them was thick with the weight of everything left unsaid over the years. There were so many wounds, so many broken promises, but here they were, sitting across from each other after all this time. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice softer now. "I don't know if sorry is enough, Ethan. Not after everything that's happened." Ethan looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the wood. "I know," he said quietly, "but I want to try." There was a pause, a long moment of silence where the only sound was the distant hum of the town outside. And then, as if unable to stop herself, Sarah let out a sigh, her shoulders relaxing just a little. "You think this is easy for me?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Do you think I wanted to be the one standing in front of you, fighting for this town? Fighting against you?" Ethan's chest tightened. "No," he whispered. "I never wanted this." Their eyes met, and for the first time that night, something shifted. The walls they had both built over the years began to crack, just a little, and in that crack, Ethan saw a glimmer of the girl he had once known, the girl he had left behind but never truly forgotten. But before he could say anything, before he could even begin to imagine what came next, the door to the community center swung open with a loud creak. Both Ethan and Sarah turned toward the sound. It was a man, tall, wearing a suit with a briefcase in hand. He looked out of place in the small rundown town. His eyes flickered to Ethan, then to Sarah, before landing back on Ethan with a cold, calculating look. "Mr. Harper," the man said, his voice professional but sharp. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan's stomach dropped. He had a feeling he knew what was coming, and whatever it wasn't good. Ethan's pulse quickened as the man strode confidently into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. The stranger's presence was commanding, and his cold demeanor sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Ethan recognized him immediately. Robert Wilkes, one of the lead attorneys on the Harper Tech project. This wasn't just a casual visit. Something serious was about to happen. Sarah stood up, her eyes narrowing as she studied the man. "Who's this?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Wilkes didn't even glance at her. His gaze was fixed squarely on Ethan. "Mr. Harper, I've been trying to reach you all day," Wilkes said, his tone curt. "We have a problem." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had hoped to keep his involvement in the project hidden a little longer, to find a way to explain it to Sarah on his own terms. But Wilkes wasn't about to give him that luxury. Sarah, still standing near the table, looked between the two men. Confusion and unease etched across her face. "What's going on, Ethan? Who is this guy?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Wilkes cut him off. "I'm the legal counsel for Harper Tech," he said bluntly, finally turning to acknowledge Sarah with a brief, dismissive glance. "We're handling the development project in this town." The room fell deathly silent. Sarah's eyes widened, the weight of Wilkes' words sinking in. She looked back at Ethan, her expression one of growing horror. "Your company?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Harper Tech? Your company is behind the development project?" Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He had wanted to find a way to tell her. He had planned on telling her, but not like this. Not with Wilkes standing there, cold and calculating, as if their entire conversation was just a legal formality. "Sarah," Ethan began, his voice faltering, "I was going to tell you—" But Sarah didn't let him finish. She took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. You knew?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You knew all along that it was your company planning to destroy this town? And you didn't say anything?" Ethan felt the weight of her words crashing down on him, each one cutting deeper than the last. He reached out toward her, desperate to explain. "I didn't know, not at first. I didn't realize how personal this was. I didn't know it would affect you." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "That's your excuse. You didn't know. You didn't bother to know, Ethan. You were going to let this happen and say nothing." Wilkes, sensing the tension in the room, stepped forward. "Mr. Harper, I need to discuss the legal implications of the delay in the project. The local protests are causing significant setbacks and the investors are getting restless." Ethan barely heard him. His entire focus was on Sarah, on the pain and betrayal written across her face. The connection they had just started to rebuild was shattering before his eyes. "I was going to stop it," Ethan said, his voice thick with desperation. "I was going to stop the project. I just needed more time to figure out how." "Stop it?" Sarah's voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. "Do you even realize what you've done? You left this town behind and now you've come back to finish the job. And you didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth." Wilkes, growing impatient, stepped in again. "Mr. Harper, the protest is gaining traction, and we need to act fast before this gets out of hand. The media is already starting to pick up on it. We need to make a decision. Either move forward with the demolition or—" "Get out," Ethan said suddenly, his voice cold and firm. Wilkes froze, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Wilkes asked, his tone incredulous. "I said, get out," Ethan repeated, his jaw tight. "This is between me and Sarah." Wilkes hesitated for a moment, clearly frustrated, but the look in Ethan's eyes made it clear he wasn't going to win this argument. With a huff, Wilkes turned on his heel and left, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan turned back to Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sarah, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Sarah snapped, tears welling up in her eyes. "That you've come back to destroy everything we've worked for. That you've spent the last 10 years building a company that's about to wipe out this entire town, and you didn't even have the decency to warn me?" Ethan felt his chest tighten, guilt crushing him under its weight. "I didn't know, Sarah," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear, I didn't know this was your fight. I didn't know it would affect you like this." "That's not the point, Ethan." Sarah's voice cracked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "You left. You left me, you left this town, and now you're back, and you're doing it all over again. You're taking everything." Ethan stood frozen, the reality of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about the project anymore. This was about everything he had done, everything he had failed to do. He had left Sarah when she needed him most, and now, years later, he was about to destroy the one thing she had left. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." Sarah wiped at her tears, her expression hardening. "Sorry isn't enough, Ethan." "Not this time." Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a crushing tide. He had spent years building an empire, chasing success, and in the process, he had left behind the people who mattered most. Now it was all unraveling. "Tell me one thing," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "If I hadn't been here, if I hadn't confronted you today, would you have stopped the project?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her that he would have done the right thing, no matter what. But the truth hung heavy between them, undeniable. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "I don't know if I would have." Sarah's eyes filled with disappointment, and Ethan felt his heart shatter. She turned away from him, her shoulders slumping under the weight of everything that had just been revealed. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't fight you and the world at the same time." Ethan stepped forward, his voice desperate. "Sarah, wait!" But she didn't wait. Without another word, Sarah walked out of the community center, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Ethan standing alone in the quiet, hollow room. The woman he had loved, the town he had left, the life he had built. It all felt like it was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Harper had no idea how to fix it. Ethan stood alone in the middle of the community center, the echo of Sarah's footsteps fading into the night. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was numb. For years, he had prided himself on always having a plan, always being 3 steps ahead. But now, for the first time in his life, he was utterly lost. The weight of Sarah's words hung heavy in the air. She had asked the question he feared the most. Would he have stopped the project if she hadn't been there? And his answer, his honesty, had shattered whatever fragile connection they had rebuilt. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside him. He couldn't let this be the end. He couldn't lose her again. He pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. One call to his team, and the project could be halted. One signature, and the town could be saved. But what would that mean for him? For the business he had spent his entire life building? Could he really risk it all for her? What does it matter, he thought bitterly, if the person who mattered most isn't part of your life anymore? The realization hit him like a freight train. All his success, all his achievements. It meant nothing without the people who believed in him, the ones who cared about him when he was just Ethan from this small town. And now the one person who had been there from the start was walking away. Again, he had to do something. With a newfound determination, Ethan pressed a button on his phone and called his assistant. "Cancel the project," Ethan said firmly before his assistant could say a word. Sir, what? Cancel it, Ethan repeated, his voice resolute. All of it. I'm not going through with it. Inform the investors and we'll find an alternative. This town isn't going to be torn down. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sir, are you sure? This is $1 billion development. The investors... I don't care about the investors, Ethan cut in, the fire in his voice unmistakable. I'm not going to destroy this town. Do whatever you need to, but make sure the project is stopped. I'll handle the fallout. Without waiting for a response, Ethan hung up. He felt a surge of relief and anxiety all at once. The decision was final, but the battle was far from over. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing on Sarah's front porch. The crisp air stung his skin, but it was nothing compared to the nerves twisting in his gut. He knocked, his heart pounding against his rib cage as he waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, and there she was, Sarah, her face weary and guarded. Her eyes met his, and Ethan saw the hurt still lingering there, but also something else, curiosity, maybe even a flicker of hope. Ethan, she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. What are you doing here? I stopped the project, he said, the words tumbling out of him before he could second-guess himself. I canceled it. The town is safe. Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. What? I couldn't let it happen, Ethan continued, stepping closer, his voice desperate. I couldn't let my company destroy everything that matters to you, to this town. I made the call last night. Harper Tech is pulling out. The town will stay as it is. Sarah blinked, the shock evident on her face. You canceled it? Ethan nodded, his throat tight. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry for everything, for leaving, for not telling you the truth. I messed up, but I couldn't walk away again. Not this time. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. She stared at him, her emotions shifting as she processed his words. Ethan's heart raced as he waited for her response, terrified that it wouldn't be enough, that he had done too much damage to repair. Finally, Sarah let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little. You really stopped it? Ethan nodded again. Yes, I did. Sarah looked down, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Why, Ethan? Why now? Ethan's voice was thick with emotion. Because I realized something last night. All this success, all the money and power, it doesn't mean anything if I don't have people like you in my life. I was chasing the wrong dream, Sarah. I thought I had to leave this place behind to become something, but the truth is, I lost something more important when I left, and I don't want to lose it again. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. For a moment, they just stood there, the air thick with unspoken words. Then she took a step toward him, her voice soft. Do you mean that? Do you really mean it, Ethan? Ethan's chest tightened, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to say. I do. I should have never left you, Sarah. I should have fought for you, for us back then. And now, I'm fighting. I'm not walking away this time. For the first time since their reunion, Ethan saw the walls around Sarah's heart begin to crumble. Her eyes softened, the hurt giving way to something else, something closer to forgiveness. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, before he could say another word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, her head resting against his chest. Ethan froze for a moment, the unexpected gesture catching him off guard. But then, as her warmth seeped into him, he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Weeks later, the town square was bustling with energy. The project was canceled, but that wasn't the end. Instead of tearing the town apart, Ethan had poured his resources into revitalizing it. New businesses were opening, jobs were being created, and the community was thriving once more. Ethan stood at the edge of the square, watching as the townspeople laughed and chatted, their spirits lifted by the hope of a better future. Sarah was beside him, her hand intertwined with his, a symbol of the bond they had rebuilt. I can't believe this is happening, Sarah said with a smile, looking up at him. You really did it, Ethan. You saved the town. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. We did it, together. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, a content sigh escaping her lips. It's funny, isn't it? How life has a way of bringing you back to where you're supposed to be. Ethan nodded, his heart full. Yeah, I guess it does. They stood there watching the sun set over the town they had both fought for. For the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. He had spent so long chasing something he thought he needed, only to realize that what truly mattered had been here all along. And with Sarah by his side, he was finally ready to start over, together.